Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Nizar Hassan, and for the first time in the history of this podcast, I'm not joined by Benjamin Red. Benjamin is resting this week. I have a great guest with me, Dr. Mona Harb, Professor of Urban Studies and Politics at the American University of Beirut. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nizar. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's really great to have you. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you do.
Okay, I'm an architect by training. Not many people know that, but I have a professional background. I'm not a practicing architect, that's obvious. I have 2 master's degrees on urbanism and urban geography, and my PhD is in political science, hence the intersection of politics and the urban studies bit in my title. I'm very interested in understanding cities and how they're produced by political institutions and actors. And I'm currently also, in addition to my job at AUB, co-leading the Shared Spaces platform at our newly established Beirut Urban Lab, which hopefully we'll have a full session on at some point with you guys whenever we're ready to do it.
Great. So we will be talking about public spaces and urban movements today and the intersection between these things and politics and social issues. Before that, we have a bunch of news to go over. Maybe the most remarkable one of this week was a man named Amer Fakhouri returning to Lebanon. This man was part of the South Lebanon Army led by Antoine Lahad, which was a militia allied with the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. So he has been in exile for a long time, and now he returned to Lebanon with apparently no legal controversies. And then upon his arrival, a lot of people were outraged, and then the authorities had to take action. Apparently, this man was not only part of the militia; he was the leader of the faction that was responsible for the imprisonment of Lebanese prisoners of wars in Khiyam. Khiyam is the most famous, prison for Lebanese fighters and resistance fighters who were imprisoned by the Israelis during the war and were only liberated in 2000 with the withdrawal of Israeli troops. And then when this happened with the liberation, he escaped to Israel. He got the Israeli passport and then from there to, I think, the States, and only came back this week. Anyway, as I said, the military judiciary has moved. The prosecutor, Peter Germanos, has issued a warrant against him and he has been arrested. And he has confessed, according to General Security, he has confessed to having escaped to Israel in 2000, as we said, and having been a collaborator for a long time. We expect that he will get the verdict of any other collaborator, which he did not expect at all coming back to Lebanon. So he must have received some kind of assurance that he will be okay coming back to Lebanon after being an ally of Israel. But now things have gone really sour for him. And a lot of people are celebrating that. Speaking of Israel and resistance, there have been a couple of news about Hezbollah this week as well. First of all, the US has imposed new sanctions on 4 members of Hezbollah, including senior members of the Jihad Council, Ali Karami, Muhammad Haidar, Ibrahim Aqil, and Fuad Shukr. And the latter, Fuad Shukr, is accused by the US of having played a central role in the 1983 attack on US troops in Beirut that killed 241 people, which Hezbollah is blamed or is accused of doing. This comes after having also imposed sanctions on a small bank called Jamal Trust Bank. We talked about this in the previous episode, whoever is interested in that. But anyway, it's part of a bigger US move to harsher sanctions on Hezbollah and all other military groups that are anti-US military groups basically in the region. So speaking of Hezbollah, the leader Hassan Nasrallah also gave a speech this week, which was the speech that he gives every year at the end of Ashura, on the 10th day of Ashura. Nothing big or very special about it, except that he maintained his aggressive rhetoric towards the issue with the rules of engagement with Israel, which we talked about in the last episode as well. And he said that there are no lines from now on in how we protect Lebanon. On the side of mobilizing his people, I think this is one of the most important moments for Hezbollah in terms of popular mobilization. I don't know if you agree, but I think Ashura itself is basically the moment where all, especially the young men are mobilized and this the anger
it's a very strong emotional moment.
And the anger of what happened
historically
with the figure that is Hussein is translated into things that are happening today. It was so explicit with Nasrallah saying that, like equating Khamenei to Hussein and saying he is our Hussein today and our leader in the fight against the US-led camp of, which is basically a metaphor for the Yazid camp back in the days. So it was a very explicit metaphor. It was like a very explicit comparison, and basically telling people that the fight that we are so emotionally connected to historically is the one that we are doing today. So yeah, just a comment on that, because it's like, I think that's one of the main ways in which Hezbollah maintains support by mixing and marrying this
religious symbolism and political mobilization.
Exactly. And when we talked about the Amal movement as well in this podcast, we had an episode about it. They also do this by putting Musa Sadr at the center of their Ashura mobilization. So it's really interesting to just observe that. We had news about the budget, the 2020 budget, because things should be happening soon. So Finance Minister Ali Hassan Khalil referred the bill to the cabinet, his draft proposal for the 2020 budget, and it will be discussed the upcoming week. It's expected to be more severe in terms of austerity measures than the previous one. According to Hariri, it will be unpopular and will probably cause demonstrations. This is what he said in the previous weeks. So this is what we're expecting, something much more aggressive than its predecessor, and also something much more timely, because the last budget was approved, long after the year had started. According to the constitution, the cabinet should send the budget now to Parliament in October, and the Parliament then has till the end of the year to pass it. So constitutionally, this is how the process should be happening. Let's see if we have more delays like last year, or it's smoother. But it seems that there's a lot of consensus among political forces that we need to pass an austerity budget this year on time, etc., to be receiving the Sadr funds. Speaking of cabinet also will be appointing people to some really major posts in the judiciary this week. They will be appointing state prosecutor, head of the Higher Judicial Council, head of the State Shura Council, and Director General of the Justice Ministry. And here is one of the moments where you see, political muscles being flexed, how the representation in Parliament and in the cabinet will be translated into putting your guy in these major posts that have a lot of impact for a long time, usually on these institutions. So now the main power is the FPM, especially that custom has it that many of these posts are reserved to Christian candidates or Maronite candidates. So the FPM will have the most leverage in them. And finally, concerning the border talks, which we had an episode about recently, there's no advancement, but there is an interesting story that was published in the Daily Star after the newly appointed U.S. Assistant State Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, David Schenker. He had a session with journalists, and he was discussing this negotiations between Lebanon and Israel about the border and the sea border, etc. And it was striking how really indifferent he was towards it. How, the kind of the arrogant attitude, but also the attitude where basically saying, Lebanon, you have to do this. If you don't do it, you're screwed. I don't care. And I'm just going to read a quote. We really have to read this quote because it's just fascinating. He says, I want to make it so that you can enter into negotiations with your neighbors. It would be great if you did, but if you don't, I'm going to go back home and eat dinner. It's not going to keep me awake. So this is Schenker making his first impression on Lebanon. Not a great one, I can say. But, when we see it in line with the visit of Secretary of State Pompeo and his language, there's seems that there's a pattern. The Trump administration is obviously extremely pro-Israel, extremely aggressive on this. But at the same time, it has this arrogant attitude, and I think it's just a lack of. I don't think it's smart at all to have this kind of diplomatic attitude. So maybe they're just putting the wrong people in these posts. So that's it for the news this week. The major news. Let's go to the main discussion, the main topic for our episode, which is public spaces and urban movements. You know a lot about this. Let's try to get as much as we can from you in this episode. But basically, whoever lives in Beirut or has been to Beirut notices that there is a problem with public spaces. There's probably a crisis of public spaces in Beirut. You don't see a lot of spaces that you can just casually, use, like parks, etc., or spaces that attract you to use them in the city. And also it feels a bit like a concrete mess that is a bit suffocating, etc. So do we have a crisis of public spaces in Beirut, or how do you see it?
Well, the short answer is yes and no. We do and we don't, because it's not the quantity of public spaces that's the problem, especially if we understand public spaces to include also streets and sidewalks and open spaces, not necessarily parks and gardens. We are a city that lives a lot outdoors. We have a strong legacy historically of using the streets as public space. And we have a lot of ambiguity between what is public and private, which makes also private spaces sometimes used for public ends. So that's where I would say it's not that we don't have enough public spaces, but our public spaces are not managed well enough for people to use them as much as they'd like to use them, perhaps. Some public spaces are quite interesting. We all know the Corniche, and immediately when we talk about public spaces in Beirut, the image that comes is that of the Corniche and the sea. We have gardens in the city as well, but we don't have enough spaces where people could meet freely without worrying about issues related to safety, to comfort, to harassment. So these are issues that relate a lot to that public space that would make some people say we don't have public spaces in Beirut. We can unpack that as we move ahead.
But there is some kind of historical pattern of shrinking those spaces in the city, right? Harsh Beirut used to be much, much bigger than it is today, which is basically the only real park in Beirut. The other parks are very small. They're more like gardens. But in general, it feels that after the end of the civil war, with the reconstruction, and during the civil war, the random construction that happened, there has been this shrinking of the space, right?
Absolutely. And if you look at the seacoast of the city, this is also a public space that shrunk enormously and got privatized. Spaces also got securitized and militarized, so we have a lot of public spaces that are owned by municipal authorities, by public agencies that are sealed and that you cannot access. So Harsh Beirut was like that for long years, for the justification of waiting for the trees to grow, and then it was a justification of we're worried of having a public space for people to meet in, and people are not able to behave well in public space, and it could lead to behavior that is uncontrollable. And then after a lot of lobbying by activists, it finally opened, and we see that it's actually fine. People are not killing each other in the park. So yes, public spaces historically were more numerous. The city grew enormously. It's urbanized a lot. It attracted a lot of people from outside of the city to find jobs. Informal settlements and neighborhoods grew. We have more and more migrants and refugees in the city, even after the war. So the spaces where people could go and spend their free time were less and less, and are currently more and more used. In that sense, yes, there has been an increasing, I would say, shrinking of public space, and their good management that makes people think less about going there.
But how do we measure this? How do we have some quantitative measures about open and public and green spaces?
Yeah, there are standards that are produced by international organizations. For instance, the WHO, the World Health Organization, has a measure of public green open space per capita. And the recommended average is ranges between 8 and 10 square meters per capita for cities. In Lebanon, a calculation that is not verified places that number at less than 1 square meter per capita in Beirut. So we see that we are way below the numbers that are
1/10 of the recommended average.
Yes, and this is where you do feel that there's not enough public space for people to use, although perhaps the square meters are available, but they're not dedicated for public usage.
I'm sure that would have a lot of effects as well on the population that's living in. I mean, this big difference is not a matter of numbers only, right?
Absolutely. It's also very qualitative and subjective. I mean, we all know that living in a dense city and dense streets with a lot of traffic like Beirut, you long to have a small space where you can just have your eye wander on a horizon, or surround yourself by greenery and just breathe, even for close minutes, like a cleaner air that's related to a tree or nature. And it's been proven that there's a very strong association between mental health and even public health and public space, that people need to have that portion of green open space in the city to take a break from work, from dense concrete environments, from traffic and from air pollution. I mean, green spaces also contribute to decarbonize the air. And there are increasingly now attempts in some cities to plant more trees to oxygenate it more. We're very far from that.
So it seems like a pretty, dark situation, or like gray situation, to use the color of concrete. Who's to blame? How did we get there?
Well, it's a collection of urban policies that led us there that are quite old. So they date back to even pre-war. It's a policy also of no policy, of not looking at public space and not thinking about the city in terms of urban planning and securing these public spaces, and allowing real estate speculation to take over and not dedicating spaces for public usage. So this would be the responsibility of the urban planning agencies. So the people who are in charge of having a new master plan for the city, so the Director General for Urban Planning, which is in the Ministry of Public Works, of the Municipality of Beirut, and of decision makers in the Council for Development and Reconstruction who can also push in that direction. This is also very closely related to transportation policies or lack of transportation policies. We don't have we have traffic management policy, but it's not being implemented properly. We don't have a public transportation system that's efficient enough for people to opt to leave their cars at home and not to take them to work. That increases pressure on streets and public space and makes the public space surrounded by cars and by car pollution and much less interesting to spend time in, or much less conducive for people to go and stay there. We don't have policies for planting green trees, for increasing the green fabric in the city, so that also doesn't help. To actually have a functioning public space or a network of public spaces that operate together, that would push people to walk in the city, you need a planning policy that relates to mobility, land use, and to public space. All these are very closely connected, and we have none of that happening. So a lot of responsibility is on the public sector and not investing sufficiently in that.
Yeah, I see that when I look at Beirut, I feel like the only transport that is being actually focused on is that connecting Beirut to other places. Like there are these, main roads and highways and bridges that make sure that you get from the airport to downtown in 10 minutes. Great for tourists. But then like most of the transport within the city is just left to the most chaotic form of of market action, which is basically each to his own car, every taxi driver with his own car, every bus driver with his own bus, nothing planned, etc. And it makes me feel like it has a major contribution to how people use and approach the city, because if the city is organized this way, you just want to get to work and then get out of it as fast as you can, because you want to breathe, as you said, or you can't handle this mess. Or you go to specific places that you feel comfortable in, but in general, the city is not welcoming, right?
Absolutely, it doesn't have that. I completely agree. And this highway engineering approach to post-war reconstruction is very specific to also planning approach that favored the car and vehicles, private transportation, and big landmarks in the city. So we want to connect the airport to downtown Beirut. That was a priority. We want also to bypass poor areas. So we make sure that the highway bypasses very quickly Dahia and the south of Beirut, so we don't even get to see it or exit there and see poverty. So we want to avoid that, because we chose to favor a global touristic city as a model of reconstruction. We did not choose to invest instead in a very different system of connectivity with the private car or public transportation that would favor pedestrians and soft mobility. Now, in recent years, there has been a policy to change that, and the municipality of Beirut commissioned a French urban agency to propose a different transportation and a different mobility and public space plan for the city. And a very interesting study was conducted by Iya Yurif called the Plan de Développement Doux, or referred to as Liaison Douce in common language, that proposes an alternative to this model of growth, which is much more people-centered and which favors pedestrianization and soft mobility modes of transportation. And the study is available online and people can check it, and it's ready to be approved and executed. It's been in the drawers since the previous municipal council, so for more than 5-6 years now, and it's not clear why it's not being implemented. It has a very interesting pilot test to launch it that would link Hirsch Beirut to downtown Beirut through Damascus Street, and would increase the sidewalks and the pedestrian connection between these two important poles of the city, and encourage people to walk much more and to park their cars and to use soft mobility transportation to move from one place to the other. So yes, the solution to what you were explaining earlier about that suffocation of getting into the city and wanting to exit as soon as possible and get to a safe, comfortable bubble that is most of the time not a public space, would be to think about mobility in ways where these 500,000 cars, I think there are even more, that get into the city every morning from the south, from the east, and from the north, would actually park at the edges of the city. And then to move into your destination, you would opt to go into small public transportation buses and then spend much more time in public space for your breaks before you take your car and go home. So this is the model that a lot of cities are adopting abroad, and that could work in Lebanon. We even have spaces allocated that could function as such. So traffic solutions exist, but it's the political will to want to think about this relationally between mobility, public transportation, and land use and housing as well. It's a very big urban planning, I would say, equation that should be put in place, that can be put in place actually.
It seems that, the municipality, which is the authority responsible for urban governance, is the main side. Like it's basically the lack of good policies or the lack of willingness to implement these policies, even when they exist, as you explained, is basically the main reason. And another thing that you touched on now is the paradigm of development in post-war Lebanon, the reconstruction project. And here is the most fascinating example is Solidaire, the company that was created to acquire basically downtown Beirut, the central district, and transform it into this mini European tourist attraction, finance.
A global city.
Yeah, a global center. And its effect are beyond, like, we talked about it a bit in the episode on Rafiq Hariri, one of the episodes on historical figures. But we were talking about this before the episode, about the aspect of, the commodification of space, turning this central hub of the city, which had a lot of popular meaning, into a place where it's mostly about land's value, right?
Absolutely. This is what we call, the key term for it is gentrification. It's mainly that you take the land and you raise its real estate value. So the way Solidaire did it is by making it very pretty. So the urban heritage got refurbished, public spaces got aesthetized to a scale of where you cannot touch them, and they become very much associated to real estate exchange value. So the use value of that space is almost nullified, and it becomes about how I can increase the real estate value of that square meter by making it reach a certain standard of urban design. And urban design is translated into an urban heritage and a beautiful public space. So they museumified the downtown of Beirut, so it becomes a very pretty museum, a showcase actually. So a lot of people come and take pictures next to it, and you can see that the brides go and newlyweds go and take pictures next to it. It's almost like a backdrop. It's not a lived space where people go and meet and buy and exchange like it used to be when it used to exist, but it's very much a very pretty vitrine of these beautiful French mandate buildings and these paved roads and these nice gardens that surround them. So that approach to public space sent a very strong message in the market, in the real estate market, even outside central Beirut, that this is a good model to speculate. And Beirut, has been always a city where real estate speculation is very high, is even before the civil war. But when you see that association between commodifying urban heritage and commodifying public space, that message cut across all of the city, and we had more and more of multiplication of urban heritage buildings that become restaurants, fancy restaurants or boutique hotels. So they're associated with a certain type of practice and use and users. And buildings adopt that model of secured private residences with gates, nice gardens and fences that you cannot cross and that are secured by private security. And the city became more and more, I would say, divided by according to this model, with these gated communities and high-end towers or small compounds, these fancy restaurants in the pericentral areas of Beirut, these high-end practices that relate to public space that is empty, but that is pretty to look at and to get a photograph next to, and the rest of the city, which has a much more organic fabric, much more vibrant, and that is much more messy and much more full of contradictions, which is more real, authentic way through which the city exists with its public spaces that are very ambiguous and that are in the street, on a sidewalk, in an alley, which was the trademark of, I would say, the signpost of central Beirut before Solidaire came and redesigned it into that fancy designed urban center.
So it seems to me that there's an intersection of market and public forces that kind of lead to this kind of development, a paradigm that is basically fueled by, finance capitalism to a great extent, or real estate capitalism. But to talk a bit about like the actual social consequences of it, you mentioned how there are two different worlds within the city, within the same city. When you go to downtown, this is the kind of public spaces that you found, spaces that you feel guilty if you step on the bench or whatever. Yeah. And then when you go to other areas, it's a completely different setting. So does this kind of shrinking of public spaces or this paradigm and the approach to public spaces cause social segregation, in your opinion? How does it divide society on lines or exacerbate existing lines of division?
Yeah, absolutely. Both social and spatial segregation are exacerbated by these types of urban policies because people will tend to stay where they're more comfortable and will tend not to go to discover other places if they're not there to discover. Like other cities that got impacted by gentrification and neoliberal real estate development, we have a lot of exclusion and segregation in Beirut, and people even speak about fragmentation of the city as a concept. So we're in a situation where we have public spaces that are freely accessible to all, but they're not used by all at all times. And I can develop that in a little bit. And then you have public spaces that are sealed off and that are not allowed to be accessed. And then you have semi-private spaces that function as public spaces in shopping malls and resorts by the sea or in private clubs. So depending on class, you would go to a certain place and not to another because you'd like to be surrounded by people who are like you, which is a social positioning that we all do depending on where we come from.
Can you give an example about that?
Well, the Corniche is a very good example of a place that's open to all, but that's not practiced by all at the same time. So you have in the early morning hours a certain group of population that uses it and that is very conscious that this is the only time where they want to use it because the Corniche, according to what they say, changes as the day goes. So they don't want to be around migrants and poor people in the evenings or during weekends. So they would avoid such spaces and go to other spaces where they feel more secure and safe, or where they simply don't want to see poverty, because when you belong to a certain middle or upper income class, poverty is not something you'd like to make it more invisible and deny its existence. And the city is very much operates very well according to this. That highway that connects the airport to downtown Beirut has a very specific function.
Exactly.
So, and other highways in the city, they bypass certain neighborhoods and they connect other neighborhoods. There's a lot of inequality in that sense. And middle classes are much more comfortable going to shopping centers, like we see multiplying in the city from city center to city mall to the ABC. And even that is classed within it. So certain people can go to city center and city mall, but not to ABC, even if it's to just walk around, have a cheap coffee somewhere. I mean, it's not cheap, but it's still a small consumption. And we see that public space in that sense becomes equated with a consumer habit rather than with a freely accessed public space, which is the prime definition of what is a public space.
I think is like one of the clearest differences between living in Beirut and living in a typical European city, right? You don't have access to public spaces where you don't have to consume. Every time I have to go out with my friends, I have to be consuming, I have to be buying things.
Yeah.
Actually, which is also bad for people's health. Like, we shouldn't be drinking and eating all the time. We can just be sitting in a park or just sitting in a place where you don't have to consume.
But this also has to do with your own positionality and that of your friends and mine too. I mean, there are parks that I could go and sit in, but I don't do it because I don't feel comfortable enough. I mean, from my positionality as a mom or as a mother, it's very rare for me to consider going to a park like Sanaya or Sufi with my kids, or to Harish Beirut. For me, it's like tedious to want to go there. I'm not sure who am I going to encounter, if my kids are going to be playing with someone like them or not. So there's a very strong class consciousness also, where these public spaces that exist are associated with a class that I might not be comfortable interacting with. And if you talk to people, this is commonly what they would say. The narrative would even develop to become one of fear. And especially now with refugees in the city, that it would equate these public spaces with Syrian refugees. Before that, it was with migrant workers, that I don't want to see these people. The city is not mine anymore. And this is where being in a secured space that where I can see people who are like me feels like a better choice.
So there is this class aspect of it. There's also the gender aspect that we see when there are no public spaces apart from the sidewalks mostly and the popular neighborhoods. Then the way that people practice this or use this public space is basically old men or sometimes young men after work putting their plastic chairs on the sidewalk and basically claiming it, right? Owning the street.
That's a very interesting paradox in Beirut's public spaces. That's very romanticized, especially by the gaze of, I would say, Western researchers who come and study the city. They like that appropriation of space because it qualifies it as an appropriation of space. This is where the city becomes yours. You're able to appropriate that street or sidewalk by making it yours. But at the same time, it has a very strong paradox in it because it excludes many others. And there's a violence in this appropriation because of this exclusion and its domination by men, and sometimes by strong men who would prevent certain practices from happening in the street. And an example I often give when I speak about this to my student is a space that's very close to my home that's completely appropriated by these strong men. And I have to walk there every day, and I don't feel comfortable enough to walk next to these chairs, these plastic chairs and these tables, and to have to pass by these men and perhaps hear a comment or be looked at in a certain way. And to avoid that, I have to cross the street and continue. And it's the experience of many young women in Beirut that have to all the time be very careful about that gaze or that potential violent harassment that could happen in the streets of Beirut. And that when we look at these spatial practices and celebrate them as being a demonstration of the ability of Beirut to be open to appropriation, we forget all about that potential violence that's embedded in that. So I do completely agree with that. Although sometimes these eyes on the street, because they're often eyes on the street, these men, they control their little corner. They are also monitoring who comes and who goes. There's a sense of community watch that sometimes has an interesting role in protecting the community in that neighborhood. And that could be interesting to document and work with if you want to think more about how to subvert it in a more collective, shared way and inclusive way, rather than making it just exclusive to these strong men.
Exactly. I feel exactly what you're saying. When I'm walking in neighborhoods that I'm familiar with, I feel this, or I have this idea in the back of my mind that if something happens, these people are watching. They kind of protect, At the same time, when it comes to being different or like not conforming to gender norms, your gender identity,
or sexuality identity.
Exactly. Your sexual orientation, like expressing your sexuality in any way, or being a woman that is not basically from the neighborhood, you will have a very different experience. So it's, as you said, it's an interesting
double-edged sword
paradox.
somewhere. Yeah.
we can talk, I mean, forever about the manifestations, social manifestations of public spaces and the political significance of them. But before like wrapping up this episode, I want to like discuss with you a bit urban activism, because you've been involved in several projects and you study them. So just like tell us just a bit about how public spaces became the center of activism in Beirut mostly, and in Lebanon recently, and maybe just a couple of reflections on those attempts.
Yeah, it's a long story, and it begins with actually Solidaire, so first activists protesting against what we discussed Solidaire was doing with the city. But I'll skip that part and focus more on the new activists, I would say, efforts that are really interesting experiments and how we could lobby for more or better public spaces in the city. I would place the beginning with the campaign that happened to cancel the highway that was supposed to cut across Mar Mikhail, the Fuad Boutros highway, which was a very interesting initiative taken by young urban activists who allied with transportation planners and urban designers to propose a counter project for the highway, a park by the name of Fuad Boutros, and found a loophole and requested an environmental impact assessment from the municipality, which was the operator of the project, and lobbied for this EIA to take place. And based on its results, they managed to show that the highway will not solve the traffic problem as it was claimed. The project was put a halt. We still don't have a park in Mar Mikhail, but at least we don't have the highway. And shortly after, there was the beginning of the mobilization around the opening of Harsh Beirut by Nahnu, and
which had been closed for a long time, right?
Yeah, since it was the trees were burned during the civil war, and then there was a fund that helped replant the trees, and then the Harsh was supposed to open, but it was never being opened. And then Nahnu started lobbying very systematically for that. It took years to reach to that decision of the governor at the time. There was a policy window that made the decision happen.
I was actually working at the organization back then.
Really?
And we did like the opening of Harsh Beirut,
Yeah.
a festival, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge win in that, and in these struggles that you feel that the advocacy, even if it would take you years of efforts, would lead to the reopening of Harsh Beirut. They started at the beginning opening it once a week, if I remember, and then it was more regularly with the volunteers that Nahnu had secured. And then the third campaign, which I think was very interesting also, was the one for Dalia, to protect Dalia from being developed into a tourist resort.
And Dalia is?
Dalia is the space which is just down from, next to Raushi, to the Pigeon Rocks. So it's that very large space by the sea where people actually can cross across the Corniche and walk down towards the sea. And it's a space that's largely used by people during the weekends. And this is where the Kurdish community also celebrates the Nowruz every year. It's very also linked to practices by Beiruti population that go back to years. It was very well documented by Public Works. So at the time, they were not named by Public Works, but who were really the engine behind this mobilization. So these, to name, I would say, the flagship really urban activists that had actions on these public spaces and led to more consciousness about how we can regain or protect at least the existing public spaces in the city.
And I think like another major initiative was Beirut Madinati, right? In 2016, there was this big campaign for the municipal elections in Beirut.
Yeah.
It was maybe the first time that civil society, so-called civil society or independent actors come together and say, let's win the municipal elections. And to me, I was just helping a bit. I didn't have a major responsibility in it, but it was the first time that I see a lot of people talking about the municipality in the first place, right? It was never a public discussion theme, topic, nothing that people discuss. But what was fascinating is that a lot of people were willing to vote, it was a successful campaign, but to get 40% of the vote... 32?
Yeah.
Okay, I had my numbers exaggerated. But to get a significant percentage of the vote facing a list with all of the major parties was a major thing, right? It was an important achievement. I would like to hear, 4 years later or 3 years later, I would like to hear your thoughts on that experience specifically before we wrap up, because it's maybe one of the only examples where we had people saying we're not only going to be technical experts and consultants to the municipality or to the local government. were actually taking over.
So urban activists were a big part of Beirut Madinati. So Beirut Madinati brought several coalitions together, but the urban activists were an important group in there. So all the people who worked on Fouad Boutros campaign, Daily campaign, Nahnu activists were part of that reflection of how will we campaign to take back the municipality. There was also a very strong awareness that enough is enough, that we know what to do. Let's just do it. We're tired of working from the fringes through the campaign. Through the campaigns, we want to go in and do the work like it's supposed to be done through urban policies that are organized, planned, related to each other, so that bring mobility and public space together, land use and housing together, because it's all related. We cannot just work on one sector. But we chose, I would say, it was a very strong choice to focus on open space, public space, a better city, a better managed city as an electoral strategy, rather than work on housing or other, I would say, contentious topics. Public space seemed to be the most common ground that would rally the largest strands of people possible across divisions. So across religious, economic, class divisions that we were talking about.
And I think, I find this interesting and controversial, right? Obviously, as a clearly left-minded person, I would think of, things like economic justice and the right to the city as a main part of mobilizing in the urban space, right? Because some people are clearly disadvantaged and others are winning. And maybe some people who were very excited about the public spaces are also excited about gentrifying some areas in Beirut that are being kind of or moving to areas that are historically working class and making them more hipster and nicer for them to be living in, etc. So I think there's always, you have to, as a campaign, you have to navigate these interests. But it was clear that Beirut Madinati was basically focusing on one aspect, which is let's get the technocrats in power and on the municipal level, and let's create a beautiful city, rather than activate tensions and mobilization resources that already exist, with people being angry against the new rent laws, etc.
Yeah, again, that was an electoral strategy, and I think if you understand public space through its land value, you would understand better the linkages we were thinking about in relation to political change. So if we understand public space, like I was explaining, through its social value and its use value, not its exchange value, the link to politics is very clear to me. So I could advocate for more public space and choose to focus on the aesthetics of it, or the need of it for public health and mental health, and even economic growth, if it would allow me to rally private sector people with me. But I know that if I take the municipality, the way I will manage public space is for it to be much more in favor of a social inclusive value that would be open to all, rather than reduce it, as Solidarity did, to its exchange value. So I would say it's a very subtle, and we go back to that, probably that double-edged sword of the public space, of recognizing it and working within it, that making sure that we're celebrating the capacity of public space to be appropriated, but making sure it's not appropriated by one group of people at the expense of others. It's very hard in the campaign to explain this, but I would say the rationale behind it, the ideology behind it, is one that is much more about social justice and inclusion and equity and livability. But we chose to focus on livability rather than the other dimensions, which might be more antagonizing to certain people, which may be fearful, whereas livability is a common ground for the many.
I see.
So that was, I would say, an electoral strategy much more than an ideological choice.
So I guess we'll see how maybe this strategy will be reevaluated for the future elections. We have actually, which is very interesting, we have municipal elections and parliamentary elections at the same time, in the same year next time, which is
what's going
very
to
scary.
happen to the activists? My God, they will collapse.
Exactly, because the same people were working in Beirut Madinati and then with the campaigns, but also because parliamentary elections mobilize people on sectarian grounds and geographical grounds, etc. So it will be maybe more difficult for us as independent activists to mobilize. But we will have another episode, I'm sure, about this, about urban mobilization and the municipal elections, and maybe Beirut Madinati specifically. We can talk about this forever, but for now we have to end. It was so good to have you here on this show.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And from now on, you're a friend of the show, and we would be happy to have you again.
Thank you.
So we'll be back next week with another episode about another topic. Until then, I'm Nizar Hassan.
And I'm Mona Harb.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast. Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Amer